The night is long in the medieval village, and when morning finally arrives, it does not come with sudden brightness, but with a slow stirring. The rooster calls from the thatched roof of a barn, and mist clings to the soft curves of the fields. You may imagine the peasant cottages lined along, a narrow dirt track, their walls of wattle and daub, their roofs thick with straw, their doors still closed against the cool of dawn. Inside, a couple rises from a shared straw bed, woven with reeds and layered with old wool. They are husband and wife, not by sudden choice, but by a long arrangement, a weaving together of families and obligations that has taken place over many seasons. Marriage for peasants in the Middle Ages was not often a matter of tender romance. Instead, it was practical, shaped by the land and by necessity. A man might marry so that fields would be tended more swiftly, so that bread might be baked while he labored with the plough, so that children would someday walk behind him, learning the rhythm of his tasks. A woman might marry so that she would have access to land and the protection of a household, so that her weaving, her brewing, and her tending of the hearth would be bound to a place of permanence. But beyond these practical matters, there was also companionship forged slowly, like bread rising in the dark, and in the soft dawn light, you may picture the wife placing a small pot upon the fire, stirring grain into a thin porridge, while her husband checks the tools laid ready for the day. The rhythm of their morning is hushed and careful. Children stir from their straw mats in the corner, rubbing their eyes. The smell of smoke and damp wood fills the room. Their cottage is simple, one room for eating, working and sleeping, though sometimes a loft above holds a bit of storage or perhaps another sleeping space. Chickens wander freely near the threshold, scratching at the earth. When the first rays of sun pierce the mist, the day begins in earnest. The husband walks to the stripped fields, narrow bands of earth that belong to his family by long custom. Though ownership is never truly his, the land is held by a lord, and his labor is owed in exchange. His wife, meanwhile, tends the cottage and garden, pulling weeds from the rows of beans, fetching water from the village well. This daily rhythm is not easy, yet it is steady, and within it, marriage is both a bond and a burden. For peasant couples, the struggle was rarely about grand passion, but about the ceaseless work of survival. When food was scarce, they bore it together. When a child fell ill, they waited and prayed together. When dues were demanded by the manor, they calculated together what little they might spare. Imagine, then, how such a marriage felt not a story of courtly love, gilded in song, but a quieter tale of endurance. Husbands and wives worked side by side, sometimes quarreling, sometimes laughing, sometimes simply carrying on without words. Their closeness was in the rhythm of tasks, in the shared glance across the hearth, in the mutual care of livestock and kin. Yet struggles came often. Dowries were meager, and a woman without one might find marriage delayed or not at all. Lords sometimes interfered, insisting that marriages on their lands be approved. Church rules grew stricter, declaring that weddings must be solemnized before a priest, even when couples had long relied on simpler vows exchanged before witnesses. For peasants, this tightening of rules could feel heavy. A union that once seemed sufficient with spoken promises now required fees, bans, and official recognition. And so, for some couples, marriage was not just a bond of love or need, but also a tangle of obligations to powers far above them. And yet, through it all, the days still turned. You may picture the slow passing of hours, the husband guiding the oxen along the furrows, the wife spinning flax into coarse thread, the children chasing one another near the hedgerows. By evening, the family gathers again by the hearth, the fire glowing low, a pot of pottage bubbling with whatever scraps the day has offered. They eat in silence or with small conversation. The air smells of smoke and earth, of wool and sweat, of herbs hung from the beams to dry. Outside, the village quiets, the mist returns, and the stars shine in a sky unmarked by lamps. And here, in this quiet, the reality of marriage for peasants is most clear. It is a tethering of lives in hardship and in solace, a partnership bound by work, by duty, and sometimes by affection that grows slowly like ivy along a cottage wall. The struggles are constant struggles, with hunger, with obligation, with disease, with the uncertain gifts of the harvest. Yet still, there is tenderness in small gestures, a husband bringing home a piece of firewood he gathered on the edge of the forest, a wife saving the last spoon of pottage for a child who lingered outdoors, the quiet sound of weaving by lamplight, steady and sure. Perhaps, as you imagine this world, you can sense its rhythm, the cycle of days that repeat, the lives bound tightly together by necessity and by choice, the hush of twilight falling once more over the cottages. This is the world of peasant marriage, where the struggles are woven into the very fabric of life, and yet where companionship quiet, imperfect, enduring was found at the heart of it. In a small village, perhaps in the gentle valleys of England in the 13th century, there lived a young woman named Alice and a man named Thomas. Their names are simple, their lives even simpler, yet in their marriage you may glimpse the quiet truth of many peasant unions in the Middle Ages. Alice was the daughter of a poor cottager, her father holding only a few strips of land, barely enough to keep his family fed through the lean winters. Her mother taught her from childhood to spin, to tend the hearth, and to keep watch over younger siblings. She grew strong from work, her hands rough with weaving, her back bent from gathering wood. She was not considered especially beautiful in the way of courtly songs, but she had clear eyes and steady ways, and in the village, such qualities mattered more than finery or fragile grace. Thomas, by contrast, was the son of a villein bound to the land of the manor. He, too, had grown with labor pressed upon him from boyhood, ploughing fields, mending fences, carrying stones for the Lord's demands. His father had taught him that survival came from steady work and careful patience, and Thomas bore this lesson in his quiet, deliberate manner. Their paths crossed often in the rhythm of village life, at the well, where Alice fetched water at dawn, at the church on Sundays when families stood side by side in their woolen tunics, at the harvest fields when every hand was needed to bring in the grain. In such closeness, marriages were often arranged not by romance, but by the gentle weaving of families' needs. And so, when Thomas reached the age where he could manage a household, and Alice's family sought a secure future for her, the union was spoken of quietly. A small dowry was promised, a single cow, some tools, and a chest of linens Alice had spun herself. Thomas offered his labor and the hope of children to work beside him. Their marriage, when it came, was modest. The village gathered in the little church of stone, its walls cold but its air solemn. A priest spoke the words, asking for vows, though in other times a simple handclasp and witnesses might have been enough. Alice wore her best wool dress, dyed with plant roots to a muted green. Thomas wore his tunic, mended but clean. After the blessing, there was no great feast, for food was scarce, but neighbors brought bread, ale, and perhaps a joint of pork to share. Laughter came easily, even when portions were small, and so the marriage began. In the early days, life for the couple was not simple ease, but a careful balancing of burdens. Their cottage was small, its thatch patched with care. Rain leaked through the roof in storms, and smoke from the hearth clung heavily to the air. Alice kept the fire alive, tended the garden, and spun thread, while Thomas walked each day to the strips of land assigned to him, working long hours behind the plough. Together, they paid rents to the manor, sometimes in grain, sometimes in labor, and struggled always to keep enough for themselves. At first, the weight of marriage felt heavy. Alice missed her mother's house, where familiar faces gathered around the hearth. Thomas felt the strain of being provider, knowing the harvest might fail, knowing a winter illness could undo their fragile security. Yet slowly, through small acts, the bond between them grew. Thomas mended the door when wind rattled it loose, so Alice might sleep more peacefully. Alice saved the best of the garden herbs for his supper after long days in the field. These gestures, though small, softened the struggles. Seasons turned, as they always did. Spring brought muddy fields, lambs bleating in the meadows, and seeds pressed into damp earth. Summer meant long days of work, sweat dripping from brows as scythes cut through golden grain. Autumn was harvest, every hand straining, every back aching, as carts creaked under heavy sheaves. Winter brought the stillness of snow, the long hours of spinning, mending, and keeping the hearth alive. Through each cycle, Thomas and Alice moved together, their marriage becoming less a contract and more a companionship. Children soon followed, as they so often did. The first was a boy, though he lived only a few winters before sickness carried him away. For Alice, the loss was a quiet sorrow, one she carried in silence as she worked. her grief softened only by the presence of neighbors who had known the same. Later, a daughter came, and then another child, each bringing joy, worry, and more work for both parents. Marriage for peasants was never just between two souls, but between whole families. Whole generations linked through children who bore the hopes of survival. Yet struggles never ceased. When the Lord demanded extra dues, Thomas had to work long days on the manor's fields, leaving little time for his own. When storms flattened the barley, meals became thin. When illness swept through the village, Alice sat by the hearth, whispering prayers, tending fevers, knowing that not all would live. Still, the marriage endured not through great romance but through patience. In the evenings, Thomas would sit by the fire, repairing tools, while Alice spun thread by the glow of the embers. Sometimes they spoke softly, sometimes not at all. Silence was not loneliness, but the quiet knowing of two lives intertwined. Years passed and their hair grew streaked with grey. Their children, now grown, began to take on the tasks of the household. Alice's daughters learned to spin, to tend the garden, to prepare the hearth. Thomas's sons walked with him into the fields, learning to hold the plough steady to mend the harness. Slowly, the burden shifted, as it always did, from parents to children. And as age crept upon them, Thomas and Alice found a gentler rhythm. They still worked, for peasants could not afford idleness, but their days were slower, their voices softer. Sometimes they would sit at the cottage door together, watching the sun sink over the fields, the air filled with the scent of earth and hay. Their struggles had not vanished, but they had learned to live with them, as one learns to live with the turning of seasons. You may picture them there, to figures in simple wool, their hands lined from years of labor, their bond forged not in sudden passion, but in the steady endurance of shared burdens. Their marriage was never a tale sung by minstrels, never a story carved into stone, but it was real, and it was enough. For in the quiet world of peasants, marriage was survival, companionship, and a weaving of one life into another, and those struggles marked every season still. In the glow of the hearth, there was tenderness unspoken, enduring, and deeply human. The lives of medieval peasants were not only shaped by the weight of labor and the demands of survival, but also by the unseen world, the realm of beliefs, rituals, and quiet mysteries. For peasant couples, marriage was not simply a legal or practical union. It was also wrapped in layers of custom, sacred tradition, and whispered superstition. Imagine, if you will, a couple standing at the threshold of their cottage, newly wed. Around them, neighbors gather, offering blessings in ways both Christian and ancient. The priest's Latin words still echo faintly in memory, yet the villagers, steeped in older ways, might press upon the bride and groom handfuls of grain for fertility, or sprinkle herbs at their door to ward away misfortune. In this way, marriage straddled to worlds the solemn order of the church, and the folk customs rooted in generations of village life. One of the quiet mysteries was the belief in the power of vows themselves. To speak words aloud before witnesses was thought to bind not just the couple, but their souls. Even when the church began to demand priestly presence, peasants remembered older traditions. Handfasting, where the hands were tied together with a cord, betrothal promises made at the village well, or exchanges of tokens such as knives, belts, or simple rings of braided metal. To break such a vow was more than a betrayal, it was a curse upon one's fortune, a shadow cast upon the harvests and children to come. And then there was the question of timing. The church forbade weddings during certain holy seasons, Advent, Lent, or major feasts, but peasants also carried their own calendar of fortune. Marriages were often arranged after the harvest, when food was plentiful, and celebrations could be sustained. To wed in May was considered unlucky in some villages, linked to older pagan festivals that clashed with Christian teaching. Winter weddings were rare, for the cold discouraged travel and gathering, but some believed a union blessed in the stillness of snow would endure, as long as the frozen earth itself. Fertility was among the deepest concerns of any marriage. Children were not only blessings but essential for survival, helping with work and ensuring care in old age. And so, customs sprouted like wild herbs around this need. A bride might carry sprigs of rosemary or rue, herbs thought to bring fruitfulness. Couples sometimes shared symbolic foods, eggs, bread, ale to invite abundance. If children did not come, whispers of curses, ill omens, or hidden sins might follow them, casting shadows on their marriage. In such cases, peasants turned to charms, to midwives, or to prayers at saints' shrines, seeking the unseen help of powers beyond their grasp. The church, too, wrapped marriage in mystery. Priests spoke of marriage as a sacrament, a holy bond reflecting divine order. Yet to peasants, who rarely read or heard the deeper theology, this teaching blended with older images, marriage as a shield against the devil, as a protection against loneliness, as a vessel for the soul's peace. At times, tension rose when church law contradicted local custom. For instance, cousins sometimes married in small villages where choices were few. Though canon law frowned upon such unions, dispensation could be purchased, but for peasants, such fees were heavy. Still, many couples quietly followed their hearts or their families' needs, trusting that God would understand what the church might not. Superstitions whispered at the edges of daily life. It was said that if a cat crossed the threshold during a wedding, misfortune might follow. If the bride stumbled on her way into the church, it foretold a difficult marriage. Some believed that weaving the couple's names into cloth and hiding it beneath the hearth would protect them from quarrels. Others tied charms of iron or rowan wood near the bed to guard against restless spirits. These small acts may seem quaint now, but for peasants whose lives were marked by uncertainty, such gestures brought comfort. Even dreams held meaning. A dream of water before a wedding was seen as a blessing, a sign of life flowing forward. A dream of broken tools, however, warned of hardship. The unseen world pressed close in every decision, and marriage was no exception. One of the most delicate beliefs surrounded love itself. In peasant villages, love was rarely the root of marriage, but it was not absent. Couples sometimes fell into fondness over time, their bond deepening with each shared task. Yet love was often spoken of cautiously, for it was seen as a force both sweet and dangerous. To love too fiercely outside the bounds of marriage was to invite scandal or worse. To feel too little within marriage was to risk discontent. And so, peasants wrapped their affections in modesty, letting them show in quiet acts the saving of a last piece of bread, the lending of a warm cloak in winter, the hum of a song shared at dusk. Mystery also lingered in the role of saints and holy figures. Saint Valentine, long before he was wrapped in modern notions of romance, was invoked for love and harmony. Saint Agnes was prayed to by maidens seeking husbands. Couples might leave offerings at shrines, asking for peace, fertility, or protection from envy. The bells of the church themselves, rung at weddings, were believed to scatter spirits that might otherwise cling to the new union. Yet for all these beliefs, marriage for peasants remained rooted in the practical. The customs and mysteries did not remove the struggles, they softened them, gave them shape, and offered reassurance. In a world where so much was uncertain, when harvests failed, when children sickened, when lords pressed harder, peasants turned to these rituals as one turns to a warm cloak in the cold. Perhaps you may picture a wedding night in a small cottage, the hearth glowing low, herbs tied to the beams above, bread and ale shared, whispers of blessings spoken softly. Outside, the fields lie silent, the stars glimmer above, and the couple, weary from the day, drifts into sleep. Around them hang all the mysteries of their timed church bells, old charms, whispered prayers binding them not only to each other, but to the web of beliefs that held their world together. And so, the struggles of peasant marriage were never just of the body, but also of the spirit. They bore hunger, cold, and obligation, but also the weight of expectation, the fear of curses, the longing for blessing. Their world was both harsh and enchanted, every act of marriage touched by mysteries, both sacred and simple, that helped them endure. As the medieval world unfolded, not all marriages were alike. The bond between a peasant man and woman, sealed in their cottage of mud and timber, was not the same as the union of merchants in a bustling town, nor the alliances forged among nobles in their stone halls. Yet, though the settings changed, the struggles of marriage echoed across the spectrum, each shaped by its own rhythms of life. You may imagine first the peasants whom we have come to know. Their marriages were simple, practical, tied to survival. Land and labor were their dowry, children their wealth, and the church their watchful overseer. Love, if it grew, was like a wild flower springing from the cracks in the field, unexpected, tender, but not always necessary. Their struggles lay in hunger, in feudal dues, in the uncertainty of harvests. To stay married was not so much a choice as a necessity, for together they could weather hardships that alone might break them. Now, let us drift to the towns where cobbled streets echoed with the sound of carts and markets. Here, marriage took on a different hue. Among craftsmen and merchants, unions often served the growth of trade. A daughter of a clothmaker might wed the son of a wool merchant, joining families and expanding networks of profit. A guildsman's wife often helped in the shop, keeping accounts, measuring cloth, or selling goods. Marriage in the town was both partnership and business contract. Its struggles not so much in the sowing of fields, but in the ebb and flow of markets. Yet even here, the rhythm of struggle was steady. A failed shipment of grain, a fire in the market square, or a sickness that swept through crowded streets could ruin families. Wives were expected to bear children and keep households, but also to assist in trade, doubling their burdens. Husbands carried the pressure of debts and competition. For some, prosperity brought comfort, but for many, it brought only longer hours, heavier expectations, and the constant worry of keeping pace, and above them in stone halls and manors. Marriage became still more removed from affection. Among the nobility, unions were instruments of politics tied to land, inheritance, and alliances. A young noblewoman might be promised in marriage while still a child, her future bound to strengthen her father's holdings. A nobleman might marry not for fondness, but for dowry, estate, or military alliance. In these marriages, love was a rare visitor, sometimes arriving later, sometimes never at all. The struggles here were of a different kind. Nobles faced disputes over dowries, tensions between families, and the pressure of producing heirs to secure lineage. A noblewoman who bore only daughters might live under constant strain, while a nobleman without sons might see rivals press claims to his land, though their halls were filled with tapestries and their tables with meats and spices. The anxieties of marriage pressed just as heavily as those of the peasant, though in another form, and still higher, at courts where kings and queens reigned. Marriage was almost never personal. It was the weaving of kingdoms, the sealing of treaties. A princess might be sent across seas to marry a prince she had never seen. Her life uprooted for the sake of politics. Her struggles were of loneliness, of unfamiliar lands, of expectations beyond her will. Such marriages often bore the weight of nations, yet left the individuals themselves in quiet sorrow. Between these layers of society, the contrasts are striking. The peasant couple, bound by survival, struggled to keep hunger at bay. The townsfolk couple, bound by trade, struggled against the uncertainty of commerce. The noble couple, bound by politics, struggled under the weight of lineage and alliance. Each faced burdens, though the shape of those burdens was molded by station, and yet, across the spectrum, some things remained constant. All marriages bore the expectation of children, the need for households to be managed, and a quiet entrance of two lives joined. Women, whether peasant or noble, carried the burdens of childbirth, of running households, of standing as the center of the domestic sphere. Men, whether behind the plough or seated in council, carried the weight of provision, of reputation, of responsibility. There were differences in comfort, of course. A noblewoman might have servants to tend her chamber, silks to wear, and bread enough to eat. A peasant woman might have only coarse wool and thin porridge. Yet both knew the sharp edge of struggle in their own ways, for neither wealth nor poverty removed the fragility of life. Childbirth was dangerous for all. Sickness cared little for station. The sorrow of losing a child, a spouse, or a harvest weighed heavy, whether in a cottage or a castle. And so, when we reflect upon marriage across the medieval spectrum, we see not only the divides of wealth and power, but also the common thread of endurance. All were shaped by forces larger than themselves, whether feudal dues, market tides, or political alliances. All bore the weight of expectation, and all in their quiet hours longed for peace, companionship, and a measure of tenderness. Perhaps you may imagine the picture now as though it were painted upon parchment. A peasant couple bent over their hearth, a merchant and his wife tallying coins by candlelight, a noble pair seated in a hall of banners, a queen gazing out at a land not her own. Each is different, yet all are bound by marriage, all carry their struggles, all hope in their own ways for moments of warmth within the bond. And in this soft reflection, one sees that marriage in the medieval world, whether humble or grand, was rarely about romance alone. It was about survival, about duty, about the weaving together of lives in the face of uncertainty. Across the spectrum, marriage was not easy, but it was enduring, and so the story of peasant marriage finds its echo in all marriages of the time. Though their cottages were poor, their struggles humble, their bond reflects something shared by merchants, nobles, and even kings, the effort to join lives, to endure together, and to find meaning and companionship amid the turning seasons. The story of peasant marriage, when looked at closely, is not only about fields, dowries, or obligations. It is also about the quieter, more hidden struggles, those of the heart, the spirit, and the delicate balance between two people living side by side through the long rhythm of their days. Marriage among peasants was often arranged with practical eyes. Families measured the land, counted livestock, and considered debts before a match was made. Yet once vows were spoken, husband and wife had to learn day by day what it meant to share a life. There were quarrels, there were silences, and there were long hours of labor when companionship was tested by weariness. Imagine a cottage, small and low, its walls of clay and timber pressed against the wind. Inside, a man and woman lived together not for weeks, but for decades, through harvests and winters, through losses and small joys. In such closeness, every strength and every weakness is laid bare. A husband's temper, quick after a long day in the fields, could weigh heavily on a wife already burdened with children and chores. A wife's weariness, her body worn by repeated childbirths, could leave her husband with the quiet ache of helplessness. Yet even in such struggles, there was resilience. Most couples learned to soften their lives with small acts of care. A husband might mend a worn shoe or gather extra kindling, so the house stayed warm. A wife might save a morsel of meat from the pot for her husband's return, or hum an old lullaby that carried him into sleep. These gestures, repeated quietly, built a bond far deeper than grand declarations. One of the most enduring struggles was poverty itself. When food grew scarce in winter, the marriage carried the burden of hunger. A husband might eat less, so his wife and children could survive. A wife might stretch a small store of grain with herbs and broth, turning thin fare into something sustaining. Together, they bore the knowledge that survival depended on both their endurance. Illness, too, pressed upon marriages with relentless weight. A fever could sweep through the cottage, leaving both parents worried over which child might survive. A mother, weakened after childbirth, might depend on her husband to tend the hearth, fetch water, or care for the little ones. A father, struck down by injury in the fields, might leave his wife to shoulder burdens far beyond her strength. And in such times, love was tested not in words, but in the quiet persistence of care, one washing the other's brow, one carrying the other's tasks until healing returned. Another struggle was the tension between duty to family and duty to one another. Parents and kin often pressed their expectations upon couples, reminding them of debts, of inherited customs, of the need to preserve family honor. A husband might feel torn between loyalty to his wife and obedience to his father. A wife might feel pulled between the demands of her in-laws and the quiet wishes of her own heart. These conflicts were rarely spoken loudly, but lingered in the air like smoke. Yet for all these burdens, bonds often deepened. Marriage was a long apprenticeship in patience. Couples learned to read each other's moods with a glance, to find comfort in shared silence, to lean upon the predictability of routine. The act of surviving together became its own form of love. Steady and enduring, if not always tender. There was also joy, though quiet, modest, often fleeting. A shared laugh over a neighbor's tale, the sight of children playing in the sunlight, the satisfaction of bread rising well after a good harvest. For peasants, joy did not arrive in grand feasts or lavish gifts, but in the steady hum of ordinary life woven into the fabric of each day. Sometimes affection grew strong, surprising even the couple themselves. Though not all marriages began with fondness, many ended with it. As the years smoothed tempers and bound lives more closely, a husband might look at his wife, her hair silvered, her hands lined, and remember all the winters they had endured together. A wife might look at her husband, slower now, his back bent, and feel not frustration, but gratitude for the constancy of his presence. Of course, not all marriages endured happily. Some were marked by deep discontent, by quarrels that never softened, by hardship that wore away at patience. Separation was rare, but unhappiness was not unknown. Yet even here, couples endured, for survival often demanded it. The bond was less about delight than necessity, less about choosing happiness than about bearing life together as best they could. What lingers most when we look back is not the sound of quarrels nor the weight of hardship, but the quiet dignity of endurance. Peasant marriages, fragile yet steadfast, were the backbone of medieval life. From their cottages came the generations who tilled the fields, spun the wool, and carried the rhythms of the village forward. And so, the struggles of peasant couples, though heavy, were carried with resilience, softened by patience, and made bearable by the small comforts of companionship. Their love was rarely sung by poets, rarely recorded in chronicles, yet it was real, and it was lasting. Perhaps you may imagine now, as the evening draws near, a peasant couple sitting by their hearth. The fire crackles softly, shadows dance upon the walls, and the day's labor is behind them. They do not speak much, for words are not needed. Their bond is in the quiet presence, in the rhythm of breathing side by side, in the simple comfort of knowing they are not alone. This, more than anything, was the heart of peasant marriage, not grandeur, not romance, but the enduring bond that grew out of shared struggle and the quiet strength of two souls learning together how to live. And so, dear listener, as the hush of history settles around us, let us come to the last chapter of our journey, a chapter not of bustling fields or whispered vows, but of quiet reflection. For when we speak of the marriages of medieval peasants, we are not only speaking of contracts and customs, of labors and laws, we are also speaking of the timeless human heart, searching for companionship amid the long turning of the seasons. Perhaps, as you listen now, you may picture a small wooden table, its surface smooth where hands have polished it with daily use, rough in places where the grain of the timber shows. A candle burns softly at its center, its flame steady, its wax pulling gently at the base. At this table, two people sit together, husband and wife, peasant couple, bound not only by the law of the land or the rites of the church, but by the rhythms of shared life. Theirs is not a love story told with great feasts with velvet gowns, or with the sound of minstrels. Theirs is a love story made in simple gestures, the sharing of bread, the passing of a cup, the quiet glance exchanged as the children sleep. Through all the struggles of their time, the peasant couple remained tethered to one another by necessity, yes, but also often by tender familiarity. They knew each other's strengths, they knew each other's weaknesses. A husband might know the way his wife sighed as she rose before dawn, reaching for her shawl. A wife might know the way her husband's step grew slower at the end of harvest, his back bent, his shoulders weary. And though life was heavy, the sharing of those burdens softened them. You may imagine how the smallness of their home drew them close. There was little privacy, little distance, little room to hide the moods of the day. And so they learned, quietly, to move together like two voices finding harmony in a song. When disagreements arose, they were not shouted in courts or recorded in chronicles, but settled in whispers, in silences, in the steady persistence of another dawn. Marriage for peasants was often bound by practical needs, land, labor, survival. And yet, within those bindings, there was also space for tenderness, space for fondness, space for the gentle bonds of shared memory. Perhaps love bloomed slowly, like a wildflower at the edge of a path. Perhaps it never bloomed fully, but still held its place, steady and quiet, season after season. And what of the struggles? They were many. Hunger, taxation, illness, obligations to lord and church, the sheer exhaustion of unending toil. These challenges pressed upon peasant couples, shaping their marriages with the weight of necessity. Many days were spent not in leisure or ease, but in striving to keep body and soul together. But here is the truth whispered softly across the centuries. Even under such weight, moments of joy could still be found. A laugh by the hearth, a hand held during a festival dance, a child's smile, soft as dawn. These were the treasures of marriage, not measured in coins or parchment, but in fleeting glances and tender silences. The church might write of sacrament, the Lord might write of duty, but the couple themselves wrote their own record each day in the quiet script of daily acts. They sowed it in the fields, They baked it in the bread. They wove it into the cloth of their lives. And so, when we think of medieval marriage struggles, we must remember both the weight and the warmth. For the struggles were real, yet so was the resilience, so was the care, so was the simple devotion of two lives intertwined. You may, as you listen, let the image fade gently in your mind. The small cottage, the low fire, the two figures seated side by side, speaking little, yet sharing much. Beyond the walls, the village sleeps, the fields rest, the stars shine silently. Within, the marriage endures, not as a grand story told in chronicles, but as a quiet truth carried in the hearts of the humble. And as our telling comes to its close, let us rest with that image of love unspoken, yet present of endurance that becomes a form of grace of peasant couples who across the centuries lived their days in steady companionship. The struggles they knew were many, yet their hearts, like ours, sought gentleness. The burdens they carried were heavy, yet shared, they became lighter. The world around them was harsh, yet within their homes, the glow of human closeness made even the darkest night bearable. And so now, dear listener, allow these images to soften in your thoughts. Let them fade into the quiet of your own evening. The rhythm of their days slows into silence. The hush of twilight deepens. The slow turning of the seasons carries them onward as it carries us all. May you, too, find rest in the thought of their endurance and comfort in the gentle truth that across time, across centuries, the longing for closeness, for companionship, for quiet love remains the same. Let the story drift away now like the last smoke from a candle. The past has spoken and now it sleeps. And so, perhaps may you? And so, dear listener, we come slowly to the end of this journey. A journey that has taken us through the winding paths of medieval village life, through the quiet struggles and whispered hopes of peasant couples bound together by love, by duty, by survival, and by faith. You may notice, as you reflect back, how the days of those long ago seemed both different and familiar. The rustle of hay in the loft, the sound of a wooden spoon stirring a pot, the creak of leather boots upon damp earth. These are echoes from centuries past, and yet, beneath them all were the same quiet wishes we hold even now, the wish to be loved, to find safety, to share burdens, and to belong to someone through the long winters and bright harvests. The marriages of peasant couples were seldom easy. They were woven with threads of hardship and hope, of obligation and tenderness. Some unions were chosen, others arranged, some were marked by patience and devotion, others by silence and endurance. But in each, there was a rhythm like the rhythm of the seasons that carried men and women forward. In the spring, young couples sowed seeds and new lives together. In the summer, they toiled side by side beneath the sun, sweat mixing with laughter, sometimes with tears. In the autumn, they gathered in what they had worked for, sometimes bountiful, sometimes meager. And in the winter, they drew close to one another, huddled against the cold with stories, with songs, and with the simple warmth of shared breath. As we look back, we may see that the struggles of these marriages were not only burdens, they were also bonds. For when survival depends upon partnership, the smallest acts of kindness carry great weight. A mended garment, a saved crust of bread, a soft word spoken in the stillness of night, each was a thread in the tapestry of medieval love. Perhaps, as you lie here now, listening to the hush of history's echo, you can imagine one such couple. They sit at a rough-hewn table, a single candle flickering. The day has been long, but it is over. Outside, the village sleeps, the animals rest, and the world is quiet. They share a simple meal. They share a glance that holds understanding. And then they, too, surrender to the stillness of the night. In their world, as in ours, love was never free from struggle, but it was always present, sometimes hidden, sometimes humble, sometimes spoken without words at all. And now, as you drift slowly into your own rest, let the echoes of those distant lives settle gently around you. Let the steady rhythm of their days become the rhythm of your breath. Let the quiet hush of their nights become the quiet hush of yours. The medieval world has faded, but the tenderness of human connection endures. Across centuries, across fields, across time itself, the struggles and comforts of love remain. Rest now in the knowledge that you have walked, for a while, in their footsteps. Rest in the stillness of the night. Rest in the gentle hush of history. Good night.